The Pastures of Heaven is a short story collection, although to me it reads much more like a novel. I think calling it a collection of short stories is more of a marketing technique than anything else. It seems to me that it works more as a novel whose main concept is setting. Just like we have stories that are character driven and stories that are plot driven, this book seems to be setting driven, which is not something that we are used to, and maybe that's why they market it as a short story collection as opposed to a novel. That is not to say, however, that the plot and characterization lack the expertise that Steinbeck is now well known for. Characterization in particular is rather strong. We get to meet some extraordinary characters that seem as if they might jump out of the page and have a conversation with us at our local corner store. We got mothers who suffer, children whose mental capacity put them at odds and in danger in their society, men who delude themselves with grandeur, and we definitely get to see some of what Steinbeck would later be well known for. The stories of small men and women whose seeming inconsequential lives actually carry a lot of meaning. We get to see their successes, their motivations, their desires, their pain, and their tragedies. This is a book that I highly recommend to any serious Steinbeck reader as a prequel to his later and greater works. It may not be one to read at a young age though. I think I gained so much more out of this book because I'm older than if I had read it, say, when I was 20. That is not to say, though, that you should not read it when you're 20 years old, but rather that you should come back to it and read it also when you are older. That's something I do with some of the previous books that I have read, because it is my strong belief that the kaleidoscope of age broadens our perspective and allows us to gain so much more out of literature. The book is divided into 12 interrelated stories. I'm going to tell you about 3 that stood out to me, although it was kind of hard to narrow it down to 3. The 4th story in the book starts on page 41, is the story of Tulareito. He is a deformed foundling whose very existence seems like a curse. The man who found him vows that he is a demon. At a young age, Tulareito is phenomenal with menial work, and he is creative beyond the capacities of anyone in his community. But he is terrible at school. This is a wonderful story about disability and multiple intelligences, important topics in public schools today. It's also a story about how disability often got equated to insanity and the poor treatment that people underwent in those conditions. Here are a couple of quotes from this story. On page 41, the text says, "Up near the Blake place, Pancho heard a baby crying in the sagebrush beside the road. He stopped the horse and went to investigate, for one did not often come upon babies like that. And sure enough, he found a tiny child lying in a clear place in the sage. It was about 3 months old by the size of it," Pancho thought. He picked it up and lighted a match to see just what kind of a thing he had found when, horror of horrors, the baby winked maliciously and said in a deep voice, "Look, I have very sharp teeth." Pancho did not look. He flung the thing from him. This is so similar to a folktale my mom used to tell me and my siblings when we lived in Mexico, and just finding it here in the book made me filled with so much joy to see that same story pop up in a work of literature. And well, that was the story of how Tulareito was found, and then he grows up to be a very different child. Here's another quote from page 46. "He ought to be locked up," Miss Martin broke in. "This creature is dangerous. You should have seen him today." "No, Miss Martin, he should be allowed to go free. He is not dangerous. No one can make a garden as he can. No one can milk so swiftly nor so gently. He is a good boy. He can break a mad horse without riding it. He can train a dog without whipping it. But the law says he must sit in the first grade repeating C-A-T, cat, for 7 years? If he had been dangerous, he could have easily killed me when I whipped him. So once again, this story is a lot about the treatment of kids with special needs and how society has certain expectations of them, without realizing that there may be other things that these kids can do other than just be good at school. This quote reminds me of something that happened when I used to work at a high school as a teacher assistant. I used to work in the special ed department, and the high school had an alternative school program where they would send kids to learn on the job skills such as mechanics or carpentry, things like that. And there was a student who seemed to always be kind of like in his own world, very, very strange kid. And the thing is that they were going to put him in a program like that, and the teacher said I refused to sign off for him to go and do this. And she said the kid is dangerous. The kid is not to be trusted with power tools. He might do something to someone or to himself. And the thing is that a few weeks later, this kid struck up a conversation with me, and he asked me about my weekend. What are you gonna do in the weekend? I told him I'm gonna be working, and he asked, what else do you do? So I said I work setting tile, and all of a sudden he started talking about how he and his uncle had worked setting tile at a house. And he went on to describe the whole process and the design of it, all of it. And I was just kind of blown away by the fact that this kid, who the teacher had said does not have the ability to be trusted with job related skills, suddenly showed that he had all this knowledge already, a knowledge that is not shown by reading or by multiplying numbers. And it kind of makes me think of this story. That experience is connected to this, because this story is a lot about that, about how we see kids with multiple intelligences, and how we tend to value certain intelligences much more than others. It's a really good story, and quite tragic. So go get the book and read it. Another story I'd like to talk about is the sixth story on page 73. This is the story of Junius Maltby, and it's about how the expectation, the societal expectation of industry for the sake of economic gain, can ruin a perfectly peaceful and happy household. This is, however, also a hilarious story about a lazy ass who can't keep focus for 1 second. For anyone who has a highly intellectual but no good for nothing family member, you'll get a kick out of this story. I'm not a big fan of comic literature and have often found that I hardly ever laugh at parts that are supposed to be funny, but this story actually had me laughing out loud. Maybe I just identified too much with Junius Maltby. Here's a quote that comes right after he finds himself needing to take care of his newborn son. They told how, on a doctor's advice, Junius bought a goat to milk for the baby. He didn't inquire into the sex of his purchase, nor give his reason for wanting a goat. When it arrived, he looked under it and very seriously asked, "Is this a normal goat?" "Sure," said the owner, "but shouldn't there be a bag or something immediately between the hind legs? For the milk, I mean." The people of the valley roared about that. Now, this may not sound as funny in without context, but once you get to know the character and you get to that spot, oh my goodness, it's just hilarious. How useless this character seems to be at times. This story also has some interesting insights about what was going on in Germany and Japan. And the book is published in 1932, but it has some sort of like prophetic instances. On page 76, it says, "At the bedside of the other, he explained the beauty, the antiquity, and the symbolism of the swastika." At the time, Germany was already using the swastika for the Nazi party, but it hadn't become what we know of today. Later on, when Junius Maltby's kid, Robbie, is going to school, he organizes something called the Boys Auxiliary Secret Service for Espionage Against the Japanese. And it's obviously just kids' game, but this is what he says about this. Robbie explained to the boys that we would undoubtedly go to war with Japan someday. It behooves us to be ready, he said. The more we can find out about the nefarious practices of this nefarious race, the more spy information we can give our country when war breaks out. Which, as I said, sounds kind of prophetic. Now, the interesting part, not the interesting part, but the funny part is that there's a Japanese kid who is kind of being spied on all the time until he decides that he wants to be part of it. And they don't know if whether or not to allow him until they feel bad for him. Robbie feels bad for him, and he says, "Say, do you speak Japanese?" he demanded. "Sure, pretty good." "Well then, you can be our interpreter and figure out the secret messages." Takashi beamed with pleasure. "Sure I can," he cried enthusiastically. "And if you guys want, we'll spy on my old man." Once again, if you read all of this in context, a lot of little funny things like that happen throughout the book that keep it very engaging. I don't want to spoil the story too much, but essentially, Junius Maltby's son Robbie is a big focus of the story. He's a highly intellectual, free-spirited boy whose free spirit is reined in when he has to face society in the form of compulsory school attendance and other factors that come along the way. And the last story I'll talk about is the 11th story on page 169. This story deals with men's desire to exist in posterity through their descendants and the aftermath of pushing for this effect when destiny has given the hint that this may not be possible. I think this was one of the most tragic stories of the collection. It was moving, a cause for introspection, and also a page-turner. It spans the lives of 3 generations. The first man, Richard Whiteside, imagines beginning a dynasty and builds a house that he says could last 500 years. He built this house based off of a small sign while he is thinking of how the Athenians and the Aztecs also built their empires by signs from the gods. Interestingly, this sign comes back to haunt the later generations. About John Whiteside, William's only son, the story says, "Most lives extend in a curve. There is a rise of ambition, a rounded peak of maturity, a gentle downward slope of disillusion, and last, a flattened grade of waiting for death." John Whiteside lived in a straight line. He was ambitionless. Only one need entered his existence. He had no children. The hunger for children was almost as strong in him as it had been in his father. Willa did not have children, although she wanted them as badly as he did. The subject embarrassed them, and they never spoke of it. In the 8th year of their marriage, through some accident, chemical or divine, Willa conceived, went through a painless, normal period of pregnancy, and delivered a healthy child. The accident never occurred again, but both Willa and John were thankful, almost devoutly thankful. This story's subject matter provides an example of how being older can afford experiences that give you perspective. As a nearly 40-year-old who wanted kids when young, but for whatever reason I don't have them, I can relate to the character's plight more readily than if I had read this when I was 20 years old and certain that someday I would have a whole bunch of kids. It opens up the question of what it means to reach the end of the line and reveals man's nature to want their blood to continue existing into posterity. Well, there you have it, my thoughts and reactions to John Steinbeck's The Pastures of Heaven. Definitely recommend reading it. It's fairly easy to read. You wouldn't struggle with it too much, and the stories are not that long. So if you want to read something along with this, like for example, I was reading the Odyssey. When I got tired of the Odyssey, I would just pick this up, read one story or two, and then come back to the longer work. It's an easy read, enjoyable.